Hi, everyone, and welcome to Power from the Ground, Southern feminist voices on critical minerals and people power transition, a podcast brought to you by Ibon International. I'm Natanya Escote, and you can call me Anaya. I serve as the gender focal point of Bantay Kita in the Philippines, and I'll be your host for this episode. This is the final episode of the series, and today we will reflect on everything we've learned about the global scramble for critical minerals, the rise of unequal free trade agreements, and the ways in which extractivism continues to shape our lives. And so the so-called green transition driven by the global north is most of all about power. Instead of addressing the overconsumption at home, powerful countries push resource-rich nations of the global south into newly dressed but structurally old trade agreements that further exploit our lands, labor, rights, and sovereignty. And this is, to put it bluntly, green imperialism, and it comes at the cost of people's rights, ecosystems, and women's unpaid care work. And so today, our episode is about resistance as well as reimagination, how we as people and feminists of the global south can push back and put forward real solutions. And so today I am honored to be in the space to learn from fellow feminists from the global south, Faria and Mina. So as we begin, maybe we could first hear from Fariha, their background and where they're coming from today.
Hi, thank you, Anaya. This is Fariha Jasmine, currently working at Badabon Sangho. So Badabon Sangho is a grassroots level organization working at the community level of Bangladesh in many areas like Bagerhat, Mongla, Noga, and Dhaka also. So our focus of the work is basically working for the women migrant workers' right, women fisher folk workers' right, agricultural rights for the women, indigenous women's right, Dalit women's right, combat against violence and girls. There is girls empowerment. There is women entrepreneurship by their handicrafts products in the indigenous community, developing the local community skills and capacity building of the women from the grassroots level. So this is the basic of our work currently. And yes, this is all about it. And looking forward to the conversation ahead.
Thank you so much for sharing, and we look forward to hearing more about what has been like in Bangladesh in the past couple of years. And I'll pass it on to Mina.
Hello, Anaya and my co-guest here from Bangladesh. I am Mina Raman, based in Malaysia. I work for two main organizations. One is the Third World Network, and the other is Friends of the Earth Malaysia, or in our language, in Bahasa, we call it Sahabat Alam Malaysia. Third World Network is actually an international advocacy organization. We do a lot of research work and also take part in international meetings and forums like the World Trade Organization, the World Intellectual Property Organization. We follow the free trade agreements. We are also in the UN COP spaces, the where the Treaty on Climate Change and all we follow. While Sahabat Alam Malaysia, or Friends of the Earth, we also interact on the ground with indigenous peoples, local communities, which also involve women. And a lot of that is also in defense of their rights in the face of climate justice, injustices rather, and environmental injustices.
Thank you, Mina. And I'm getting even more excited because I'm noticing that I feel like in this conversation, we're able to have perspectives of both a lot more grassroots, but also be able to oscillate between the scale and the local, regional, as well as international a line that we all engage in, especially in this kind of work, which is inherently interconnected with all the other systems and sectors. And so I really look forward to this. And so to segue, across Latin America, Asia, and Africa, we are seeing the same patterns across our countries. Large-scale mining projects displacing communities, trade deals stripping away sovereignty, and corporations rebranding themselves as green. But at the same time, we also see powerful resistance coming from indigenous struggles, women's organizing, and community-led campaigns that are able to expose the hypocrisy of the so-called transition. So my first question is, how do we challenge resist and fight off green imperialism that exploits not only nature, but also people's rights and women's unpaid labor. And so we may begin with Fariha in this question.
Thank you so much. So when we talk about the just transition or feminist values, many women may not use those exact words in the grassroots level, but they live on those values every day in their daily life. So feminist values mean caring for people, nature equally, sharing works, decisions fairly, and standing together in solidarity. These are the same principles that guide our daily lives here. So when women support each other during floods and share foods when facing income drops or rebuild homes after cyclones, a fair transition for us means moving away from the system that depends on women's unpaid labor in the destruction of our environment. So it means recognizing women's traditional knowledge, for example, how they save seeds that they can survive in salinity, and how we use mangrove leaves to feed goats, or how we plant for the storms. I'm talking about in the coastal areas of Bangladesh. So when we talk about all this and then valuing the care work, not as charity, but as an essential part of the local economy. So ensuring that women lead decision making, not just attend meetings, but actually decide how adaptations funds used and what projects happen in our lands. So in the global south, women are facing similar realities. For example, like from fish farmers in the Philippines to women fisher folk in Kenya or small farmers in Latin America. They see how these big trade agreements or green energy investments exploit their land or their labor. So we connect with them through solidarity networks by sharing our stories, joining global campaigns, by exchanging skills. For example, as I'm talking about the women in Mongla, they learn from others about how to monitor corporate impacts or how to demand climate funds directly from the local women group. And a feminist vision of transition is not about replacing fossils first with other forms of extractions, like lithium or carbon offsets. So it's about changing the system itself, and it's about shifting powers to the people, especially women, who cares for the earth and the communities. So for us in the communities or in the grassroots levels, if it's coastal areas or it's in the land areas, that means future where development respects life, where mangroves are protected, women's labor are valued, and communities control their own paths of progress. So that kind of transition we dream of and work for together around the women in the world.
Thank you, Fariha. It's maybe perhaps later we could also look into the material ways that the women in your communities have been able to negotiate, like you're saying, which is such a huge thing when we are trying to learn how to capacitate one another in the advent of so much moving in the world, and then these host communities being impacted, but to actually capacitate one another and empowering one another to navigate them with dignity. And so maybe we can also discuss some examples of that later. But before that, I would like to pass it on to Nina.
Yeah, thank you, Anaya. I think the issue, as Fariha says, sometimes at the level of the local communities, really one needs to understand the nature of the problem. And particularly in the aspect of critical minerals, one of the things that I would like to stress is that many of our governments in the global south are now paying attention to the fact that in the past, they don't want to, I mean, they were not allowed to export value-added products. And so many of our governments in our parts of the world are now stressing that they want to ensure that because they have the critical minerals in their own land, they don't want to replicate the old model of extractivism. So what they're saying is that we need to ensure that we have value add in our own countries, and then only we process it here locally, and then we export it. But much of these policies are actually blind to the gender dimension of the problem, or even the community impacts of the problem. Let me just contextualize that very quickly in terms of Malaysia, because we are seen as one of the very important countries outside of China to supply what's called rare earths. Now, we all know that rare earths are very critical, not only for the energy transition, whether it's solar or wind turbines and so on, mobile phones, but it's increasingly demanded also for the military industrial complex. So we are really part of a large extractivist model, which seems to suggest that we do need to continue the extractivism and not look at, as you had pointed out right in the very beginning, how do we look at alternatives? How do we not replicate the same old style of extractivism? How do we take into account feminist principles and local community input? How do we change the governance in terms of decision making? All of which actually needs massive, massive change in, or what we call system change in the thinking. So we do really need to also focus on the issue of reducing consumption and changing the production models so that actually the people who benefit are the local communities, indigenous peoples, women, particularly those who are heavily impacted. Maybe I'll just talk about one little story. Many years ago, I myself am actually a public interest environmental lawyer. And in the extraction of a rare earth, where we had this giant multinational company from Japan come to our country and start extracting radioactive waste. They wanted the rare earth, which actually contains radioactive waste. And that radioactive waste, they claim, was actually low-level radiation. So they claim it's low level, so it's not a problem. It's not like a nuclear power plant. But what we actually saw was that this plant was actually located right in front of a new village of 10,000 people. And they were carrying on as if there was not a problem. And so we found many women in the community, mothers, for instance, miscarrying babies. They are supposed to be normal mothers who have no previous history. But when they were, high level of miscarriages, something like 3.5 times the national average. And then we also found children who were suffering from deformities, children who were suffering from leukemia. I mean, you don't immediately see cancers, but what you see is that the pre-cancer with leukemias and others, all of which actually makes it very complex for women, particularly, because they are the front line of the health of their family. They continue to be the most important, aspect of the household, who is the caregiver. And of course, all of this is not taken into account, but they bear the brunt. But what was very good about this story, and I will end on this very important note, they mobilized, they understood what the impacts of radiation was. They really mobilized in the thousands. They marched on the streets, they campaigned, we went to court. But after 10 long years, we managed to kick Mitsubishi Chemicals out of this country, together with collaboration from our Japanese counterparts, our friends there who demonstrated in front of Mitsubishi Chemicals. We had public interest groups in the United States who were also supporting us, fighting the advisor who was advising them, who was from the Johns Hopkins University. So we had to really network internationally to kick Mitsubishi out. So this resistance really requires deep knowledge, solidarity, and all forms of connection at all levels. And so in the area of critical minerals, we really need to connect at all levels.
Thank you so much, Mina, for that. And while we're there, you mentioned this multi-sectoral engagement that, and also one of the anecdotes you mentioned, the 10 years, that the struggle for certain things could take up to a decade, and I'm sure more. And I'd like to ask, taking 10 years in mind, what do you think could be like the lessons moving forward? Like in despite this being an active resistance and struggle at the moment, particularly with rare earth minerals, taking into consideration the things that you listed down just now, moving forward, how can national governments or in Malaysia, while navigating these global trade rules and actively create space for and integrate community-led, women-centered models instead of sidelining them because of this rush for critical minerals?
I think the good thing about, well, the good or the bad thing, unfortunately, because the community and the children in that community actually suffered the impacts. So we have documented them. We've even produced a book. Now, what's useful in that lesson is that we are able to show the adverse impacts and the lessons that we have learned from the community side, and where government takes the side of corporations, it ignores the impact on local communities. So there's a lot of advocacy now in terms of countering our government policy, who are pushing the rare earth extraction. And so they are developing the law and developing the protocols and so on, which we are really engaging with. And we are forcing them to come to the table and say, you do need to take stock of all this. And we're saying you cannot mine in environmentally sensitive areas. You cannot impact indigenous peoples and their land rights. You cannot impact adversely health and impacts, particularly women in the front line. So we are articulating that and saying, these are the examples, and you cannot do this without taking on board these very important elements. So we are trying to establish no-go zones, free prior informed consent, changing the way in which government just issues top-down orders. So pushing the governance side of things and not simply trample on the rights of local communities, indigenous peoples, and women.
The mention of establishing, making it really clear that we have to acknowledge areas that are really worthy of conservation. I to lead it back to women-centered advocacies. I'm curious, Fariha, you were mentioning engagement with communities, with women on the ground, and taking consideration also the coastal communities that you mentioned as an example. Could you give us any examples of how your community has been able to scale up the women's negotiation skills and the traditional ecological knowledge of these women to a level where we can effectively lobby with the national government?
I got it. Thank you for repeating. So, in the coastal community that women live through, so many green or development projects, parts of like, for example, like power plants, eco parks, or maybe shrimp parks, like shrimp farms that claims to bring jobs or protect nature. But when you look closely, these projects are often do more harm than the good. So they clear our mangroves, pollute our rivers, and make our land salty to grow any crops. So the women here feel it first. And because when the land or water is destroyed, the women who must find new ways to feed their families. So many of these green projects rely on women's unpaid works. For example, women who collect water from far away, or maybe plant trees or maintain homestead gardens, they instead never get recognized or paid. The time, energy, and everything does become invisible as a part of this project's success. So our fight begins with knowledge and unity. In Mongla, in the coastal area, I'm saying, women have started coming together through their self-help groups and community circles to discuss what's really happening and who gains and who loses from these so-called green plans. once we understand, we raise our voice together. We attend meetings, talk to the local officials and negotiate with them, and maybe question to the environmental impact assessment that happens before any kind of projects. So who are watching this, who are reading this, who are getting access to these types of informations, and when there is any projects going on, does the women are involved in the decisions making, or do they even know about it? So our focus becomes on giving them this knowledge and sharing that you should be also a part of this decision makings, and share stories with the journalists or visiting researchers also. When women also keep records and testimonies of lost land, destroyed fisheries, and unpaid care gardens, so that when we demand or when they demand justice, they have proof. So with this, it's from their own speaking or sharing that they learned that resistance does not always mean that saying no to everything. Sometimes it means asking for real accountability. For example, what kind of questions they ask? They ask, are the women consulted in in the project decisions? Will the project protect the local livelihoods, or does it restore nature or destroy it? So when they fight, building local alternatives too, and like mangrove forest farming, women-led car fattening, and collective saving groups. These may be small, but they show that development can come together from the community, not from the corporates.
Thank you so much, Fariha. And I am reminded of an anecdote. I'm reminded of a finding that my team in the Philippines and Bantay Kita shared after they did field work in the southern part in Mindanao. And it reminds me of what you're saying about what kind of development we want and how to get to it. And to also amplify one thing that one of the community leaders, Adatu, an indigenous leader in Mindanao, said along the lines of that they are not against development. They're not against just energy transition in general, but for them to not become the sacrificial lambs of this process, that there is a way, there has to be a way to do this in an equitable and people-centered nature. And so moving beyond resistance, we must also reimagine. Feminist movements across the global South have long put forward principles that center care, justice, and solidarity over profit, like you're saying. In the face of corporate-driven green agendas, these feminist visions are crucial because they show us that a just transition is not only about technology or energy, but it's also about transforming the very systems that can also exploit both people and planet. So my next question is, what feminist principles are at the heart of a truly just and people-powered transition for the global South? How can feminist internationalism, as we're doing right now, collectivizing and trying to look at different countries' approaches, how can we build genuine solidarity and counter the extractive trade regimes that we are seeing today?
Okay, I think taking from all the lessons that Fariha has already mentioned in terms of democratizing governance and knowledge, I think that's really important. Ensuring participatory decision-making processes that includes grassroots feminist movements, indigenous women, and local communities, and so on. And then I do think that one point that she said was challenging the technocratic and the corporate-led models by valuing lived experience and local knowledge, which is really key. Now, one of our problems is really that the trade agreements that are being negotiated by our government, most of the time, our governments do not listen to the voice of those of us who say that what you are doing is actually compromising your policy space. That's the term that we use in the international advocacy, where the rules are being drafted by the corporates through their powerful US and Japan and the European Union and all the hegemonic powers that be, who are not really interested in our rights and the people's rights. So when we point out to them, for instance, just to give you a very simple example of investor-state dispute settlement. Now, many of the free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties actually enable the corporation to sue the government, sue our governments for actually taking action to stop a particular corporation that is causing harm. For instance, its health, or instead of nuclear power, you want to move away from nuclear power, the nuclear power company can actually sue your government. Or if you have taken action against a particular corporation for causing health impacts, the company can sue the government in international arbitration centers for billions of dollars. Now, many of our governments go into these agreements being blind, and they are not even taking into account the fact that you're losing your democratic space. The government itself is losing its democratic space in decision making and surrendering it to the corporate-led model of neoliberal agendas. So this is where I think the feminist movements, many of the feminist movements have worked together internationally in solidarity with the trade justice movement, with the climate justice movement, with the environmental justice movement, where we really, both North and South, will have to push for the education, the advocacy, and the pushback in these kinds of unequal agreements that actually wreak havoc in our communities. So there's a lot of level of understanding, and to also value care work and social reproduction. Like I said, gender injustice is always tied to the inequalities and inequities, not just global North-South inequities, but also in our countries, where the whole gender dimension of the problem is actually sidelined. Nobody really takes this into account. So we have to acknowledge and redistribute unpaid care work, which is really critical. We have to acknowledge the fact that reparative economic models that actually redistribute wealth, land, and resources. We have to support livelihoods that are ecologically sustainable and socially just. There are many models like this. So in the transition, this is why in the just transition, not just of the energy transition, but in terms of the global just transition, there are many levels of changes, of systemic changes that need to be brought about fundamentally to actually ensure that those of us who are making these calls and demands are able to actually hold our governments to account and the northern governments to account. Otherwise, change will not happen. So mobilizing at all levels is absolutely critical.
Thank you so much for that, Mina. And before we circle back to it, maybe we can also share, get some response from Fariha as well.
Yes, Mina has already shared it very beautifully with proper information. So I'd like to add that, and I agree with what Mina says, that combining community power, public pressure, and legal rights may help these local projects to stop or maybe minimize. And the first step is to organize locally, bring together women, farmers, youth to raise a voice, united against unfair projects. Then maybe demand transparency, ask for all the project documents, environmental reports, and consultations records. Maybe make them all public. Use media and storytelling to expose how the project harms land, water, and women's livelihood, especially for like local radio, social media, and even street theater can also be spread fast. I'm saying all this on the local level because I think Mina has already shared about the global level. So I'm talking about the local level. At the same time, build alliances with journalists, lawyers, and other movements to strengthen our fight. File petitions, challenge illegal approvals, or maybe pressure the local government to act responsibly. Finally, always propose community-led alternatives, maybe small-scale, fair, and sustainable trade models that protect both the people and the nature. This way, maybe it doesn't just resist injustice, also shows that real development, like how the real development should look like.
Thank you so much for the very clear examples, Fariha. And one of the questions I also wanted to ask from Mina is that, well, both of you have painted a picture of the difficulty on the ground when there is a task to amplify the lived experiences and the consequences on the ground, particularly for women. So for Mina, you mentioned this engagement and the realities when it comes to the international corporations and the governments, and it's really stacked up, and it disproportionately affects women on the ground in the host communities. And if the tools of governments or if the tools of these corporations can really be used not against just the host communities but also the governments, what are the alternatives about making it more costly for corporations to operate this way through global consumer pressure or divestment campaigns? Is this something that could be applicable or relevant, or is there a better alternative that we can push for international corporations and our local governments as well? Are we talking about building power not through just negotiation, but are there ways to create legal, financial, reputational risk for the exploitative model that we are facing?
Yeah, very good question. I think we need to do everything that's possible. There's a lot that we can learn from. Maybe, would be remiss of us not to talk about what's happening in Gaza and Palestine, where you can really see the horror that's happening and the impact on women and children in particular, which really, the most violent of genocide, which is pushed by the military industrial complex with the Zionist regime, and where there's absolutely no respect at all for international law and any kind of accountability. So many of us also talk about how do you actually hold governments to account? And maybe just as an example, the kind of pressure that was brought to bear in relation to how many movements around the world, particularly in London, in Paris, in Brussels, in Washington, in New York, people marching on the streets demanding action against the United States, the boycott, divest, and sanctions that in support of the Palestinians. These are the examples. These are really examples of real solidarity and push. And in fact, the ICJ advisory opinion, which was pushed by South Africa, all these actually give us examples of how you can hold the most intransigent governments to account. It's not easy, but it really requires international solidarity and mobilization of global North and global South movements at a very, very real level. So there are important lessons to learn. And there are many lessons. For instance, just to give you an example, one of the most important lessons from many years ago was the movement against infant food formula. I don't know how many people know about this. I mean, I come from I'm not young anymore. So we have seen the big fight against corporate power in relation to baby's milk. The mothers were told that their milk is not good enough for their babies. These corporations went into hospitals and were campaigning and advertising and making women feel as if their own bodies are not enough for the children. So there was a whole worldwide movement of not only women, but also others who were supporting to actually hold the corporates into account. The infant food formula mobilization against infant food formula, and that was really important with the cooperation of the World Health Organization. So you have marketing practices for countering marketing practices in the hospitals and so on. So all that actually led to changes which took a lot of effort and connection and power of people. So I do think that we have to reclaim that power. I'm not just using this as cliche. We really need to connect the movements. We need to support each other. And I think particularly in this time and age, we really have a very difficult time because you have a United States which doesn't even acknowledge that the climate is a problem, they've exited the Paris Agreement, and they don't give a damn as to the damage that they are inflicting around the world with their fossil fuel extraction and pushing others to actually abandon climate change. And so there's a lot of fights. I mean, I think we do need to acknowledge the fact that this is not a fight which is new. This is a very important fight which is alive. We learn the lessons, and we can continue to actually connect all the movements and not work in silos. But I do think that the most important thing we need to do is to strengthen the movements in the global north. Because whatever I say, Anaya, or whatever Fariha says, our governments will be forced to toe the line. And it's unfortunate. I mean, I know this in the Philippines, where you still have a close relationship with the United States. I mean, we cannot allow this kind of control, not only the expansion of corporate power, but also governments that don't care, don't respect any values, and they don't even have any humanity. So there's a lot to do, and I want to say that there's a lot of hope as well. So we do need to strengthen and mobilize and resist and change, and we have done this before, and we can do it again.
Thank you so much for that, Mina. And so we've heard a lot of examples today that affirm that the struggle on many levels, both locally, regionally, and internationally, for a just transition and equitable development. It's a global issue, and it's deeply feminist. That extractive trade regimes and neo-colonial mining and false climate solutions connect the struggles, whether in the Andes or West Africa or in Southeast Asia. But equally connected, we also see the alternatives. You guys have mentioned community-led activism and solidarity across sectors on the ground and international spheres, holding international corporations accountable in many ways, such as reclaiming the power that we have, like you mentioned, Mina, having also been inspired by the BDS movement. After people in the world have been appalled by what is happening in Palestine, in many ways, we also we can utilize and we can use what is being catapulted in the world to also provide that same shock, but shock in terms of the realities on the ground in our countries, and maybe perhaps even utilizing or jumping on the board to have solidarity with countries like the Congo as well, as we see similarities and parallels in our communities. And also uphold, at the end of the day, people's sovereignty and self-determination over their spaces, their resources that they rely on, and they know how to handle and engage with sustainably. And so, and ultimately, these creates pathways rooted in solidarity, justice, and sovereignty. And so, perhaps as we close this roundtable, I would like to bring back the microphone to you guys if you have any last comments or call to actions for those listening to us. And perhaps we can start with Fariha.
So thanks again, and for such an amazing podcast and such an learning sharing opportunities from Mina and you, Elena, as well. I really appreciate it, and knowing about so many things was really great. Lastly, as an activist altogether, I want to say stand together to protect our land, our rights, our water, and hold corporates accountable for a fair and just transition world, maybe not only a country. That's all I want to share. Thanks again.
Thank you. And Mina?
Well, yeah, I also would like to acknowledge the fact that it's great to know what Faria is doing on the ground. This is the first time I'm meeting her. So I think our knowledge and strength actually comes from people's mobilizing on the ground. It's no point, sometimes people ask me, you go to all these international meetings and what are you doing? Why are you always traveling from one meeting to another? And I say that, we have no choice and no alternative to do this, because we have to, what is the most important job is actually to speak truth to power. And that truth actually is rooted in grassroots struggles. It is not a truth that comes out of lack of experience and lived experience. And I think that's critical. We take in our hearts the fights and struggles of our local communities, our women's movements, our indigenous peoples, with so much of they've got so much of solutions, and they've been trampled on. And the problem is really that there is this, we have to decolonize our minds. the colonial mentality that, we may have been liberated in terms of our political liberation. We've got independence, but our minds have not been liberated. We are still so colonial in the mindset in terms of being always an ally. The Western world is acting in our interest. That's what a lot of our education models teach us, that the Chicago School, the Washington Consensus, they have the answers, but they don't. They are actually destructive. And I think we really, at the heart of it, is a decolonizing of our minds and a decolonizing and a fight for reclaiming our rights, our dignity, and that we do know what to do. And it's about time our governments listen to us. And of course, the connection and the international solidarity, most of all, is important. And we have to continue this at a speed that we have never seen before we have more disorder in the world.
Truly, I really appreciate being able to hear the explicit examples from both of you, from your respective countries. And I almost don't want to be the one to conclude, because Mina did that so well, to remind us that, as you mentioned earlier, we can do this. We've done it before. And on the note of decolonizing our way forward, we take note of the intrinsic power that women have always had prior to being forced to engage and to negotiate in these neo-colonial spaces and militarization that we are facing now. And so in an attempt to conclude after Mina's very important, very clear stance, I would just like to say that from Bangladesh to Malaysia, the Philippines, and to Palestine, women are not only resisting extractive energy models, but they are also going to resist, they're resisting the violence of neo-colonial international corporations that do not recognize women as a proper constituency, but also women as leaders, great leaders with care. And so we weave this unified vision where we fight for a just planet that is inseparable from the fight for demilitarization and women's self-determination to uphold women's dignity. So again, I am Anaya Escote, and this is Power from the Ground, Southern Feminist Voices on Critical Minerals and People Power Transition. Thank you to our guests today, and thank you to everyone that is listening to us. May we continue this fight to resist false solutions and build real feminist people power transitions that our communities and the rest of the world urgently needs. Thank you so much, everybody.